Hello and welcome to this episode of Class is in Session. I'm your host, Ashley Stevens, and this show highlights the latest happenings inside HBCU classrooms, public policy issues facing these historic institutions, and we also shine a light on HBCU leaders, administrators, students, and alum who are making major moves, particularly in business, the arts, and education. And one of those alums is Robert T. Stevens, the Chief of State and Regional Operations for Education Reform Now, which focuses on public school choice and policy that specifically impact Black and Brown communities. In his current role, Robert manages executive directors in 7 states, regional expansion models in the South and Northeast, and helps elect reform-minded Democrats nationwide. As a first-generation college graduate of HBCU Winston-Salem State, a former public school teacher and former staffer of the late Congressman John Lewis, Robert Stevens is an advocate for the power of education to lift one up out of poverty. Hello and welcome, Mr. Stevens.
Hello, how are you doing today, Ashley?
I'm great. It's always good to see you. I've kind of known you through the years, but particularly through your education policy work. And that's kind of what we want to shine a spotlight on is how your personal story led into your professional career and success. So first, tell us a little bit about what you do in your role with Education Reform Now and what their mission is.
Absolutely. And so in my role with Education Reform Now, I have the privilege of working with some amazingly smart individuals who we really try to level the playing field. We realize that education has not worked for Black and Brown students, and we want to make sure that we can create a system that is more equitable. And so we do that through moving policy. We do that through helping elect individuals who care about moving really good policy. And at the end of the day, I think about it this way. No matter where you live, your zip code should not define the quality of education that you receive. And so we work day in and day out to make sure that no matter where individuals live, they have access to a good quality education.
That makes a difference. You're right. Where you live should not determine the type of education, quality of education that you receive as well. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how and why you decided to choose an HBCU.
Absolutely. And so I grew up in Rayford, North Carolina, which is in the southeast part of the great state of North Carolina. I grew up, education has been really, really important in my life. It's the great equalizer. My mother worked exceptionally hard. I think through her life and in my father's life as well, it was a little bit different, right? They grew up in rural North Carolina. Education was different. I think about my grandfather. My grandfather would tell a story sometimes that he went to school 3 times in his entire life. And all 3 times the teacher was absent, right? And so that really played a huge role in how my family faced education. I think my mother and father both experienced abject poverty growing up. My mother would tell me sometimes how she would have to walk to school, right? And what she had for lunch was biscuits that they made, right? Or she maybe experienced some difficulties with clothing, right? And all those certain things that come along with poverty. And so my mother worked really, really hard. My father, they worked really hard to make sure that all of their children received college degrees. I remember, Ashley, when I was 5, I ran away from home because my mother would always sit me on the counter and make me say my ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. She instilled in me the value of education. My mother believed that you could do anything and you could become anything if you work hard. And I think those attributes she passed on to me. And so when I was 5, I ran away to the back of the neighborhood to my aunt's house to get away from her so that I wouldn't have to do my ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. But I look at where I am right now, working in education. I think about those pivotal moments. They really shaped and made me who I am. And so I'm a son of North Carolina. I'm someone who, I really wanted to go to UNC Chapel Hill, right? Being from North Carolina, it's the flagship university. But I went to Winston-Salem State University on a college tour and I fell in love. I found professors who not only taught me what happened in books, they taught me what they did in their life. I had professors, Dr. Larry Little, who taught me, political science, but he had a Supreme Court case, right? In which he was the individual who was in front of the Supreme Court. And so I think about that experience, the HBCU experience. It was a family and it still is, right? We call ourselves the Ramley, and these individuals took me in. I'm a 1st-generation college student. My mother and father, they didn't have to navigate the challenges of going to college. But I did. And when I navigated that, I had a family there at Winston-Salem State University who made it much, much more easier. My professors invited me to their house for dinner. My then chancellor, Chancellor Harold Martin, right? When I became an alpha, he gave me the grip on the yard, knew my name. And so those things made a difference. And they really helped me become who I am today.
That's powerful. The power of education and what the struggle your parents went through to make sure they instilled in you the importance of it. And you ended up not only being the first in your family to attend college, but also you ended up working in education, right? You're also a school teacher, former school teacher.
Yeah, I'm a former school teacher. I do want to know. I would be remiss if I didn't say this. My oldest sister, Nikki, I call her the Jackie Robinson of our family. I have 14 aunts and uncles, and she was the very first person in my entire family to go to school. So
Wow.
Nikki is our Jackie Robinson in our family, and had she not done it, I don't know if I would have been able to accomplish it. So yeah, but I did become a school teacher. I taught with Teach for America. I think that's another thing when I think about HBCUs. Initially, Teach for America did not recruit at Winston-Salem State University. I only found out about Teach for America because I had a good friend, Lamar Crawford, who went to NC State. And I was doing some volunteer work with my fraternity at a school, and he said, "Oh, you're really into this. Like, you should look into Teach for America." And I looked into it, applied, and I got in, right? And it was a surreal moment. We never had anyone from teach from Winston-Salem State University get into Teach for America, and so that really changed the course of my life. I was on my way to law school, and while I say this all the time, they paid me not a lot, but they paid me to teach those kids. But I really should have paid those kids because they taught me more than I could have ever imparted in them. And so I was on my way to law school. I became a teacher, and I really saw how poverty. And I grew up in poverty, to be clear, but it was a different type of poverty in Charlotte. I taught at Ransom Middle School, and it was very different, right? I had kids who, I never forget, I would get mad at a kid because he would very rarely do his homework. And I
Mm.
pulled him out of class one day, and I was just like, "Yo, what's happened? I need you to do your homework." And he looked at me and was just like, "Mr. Stevens, like, we live in a car. If my mother doesn't park near a light, I can't see, I can't do my homework."
My
Right.
Lord.
And so like the challenges that they faced were remarkable. I had kids. I had to keep a pantry in my classroom because kids didn't have anything to eat. There were times where I used to coach. There were times where I would have access to the showers, and I would have to come in a little bit early because kids didn't have running water, and they just didn't wash. And so the amount of challenges that they face, and were still able to overcome are remarkable. And so I said to myself, I made a promise to myself, like, obviously I'm not going to law school. I think that we can fix education. I think that one of the greatest ways we fix education is by dealing with poverty. So I left the classroom and moved to DC to pursue a Master of Public Policy degree with a focus on education policy so that we could fix some of these like strident issues that exist.
Wow. Wow. That's powerful and insightful to see just some of the day-to-day struggles students have that allows that those are clearly reasons that they cannot show up as their best selves in the classroom, right? So
Right.
kudos to you for stepping in for those students who really needed you. And now you're doing that on an even larger scale with education reform. Now, obviously you talked about poverty being a barrier. What are some of the other barriers, particularly for higher education access for Black and low income students today?
That's an amazing question. I think some of the number one barrier, in my opinion, is really the affordability of college, right? When I went to school, it was much more affordable. A Pell Grant covered almost all of it. Now, that's just not the case, right? And so college is really, really, it's really, really expensive. And so individuals look at the price of college and they say, like, I can't afford it. I don't know how to, pay for this. And then when we think about how this impacts like black and brown individuals, the racial wealth gap is real, right? And so what we see is, predominantly individuals go to school and they have to take out a lot of loans, which negatively impacts them for the rest of their life. And so there's some work that we need to do in terms of college and making it more affordable. I think we also need to look at, like the thing about affirmative action, how those policies are now being revoked. So many of the advances that we made in college, right? Making sure that individuals have access to it, making sure they can afford it, making sure they're receiving a good quality education, K through 12. Some of those advancements are being taken away, and so we have to really fight to make sure that we don't lose everything that we worked hard to gain.
Speaking of fighting, I know there's always a fight, advocacy wise, policy wise for funding, particularly for historically Black colleges and MSIs as well, minority serving institutions. What policies do you think should be in place to ensure that these institutions receive adequate funding and resources?
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to fund them like they should be funded, right? When we look at schools, you just had a lawsuit a couple years ago in Baltimore. HBCUs brought a huge case against Maryland because they were not being funded. When you look at the funding in North Carolina, we have 10 HBCUs, and like they're not being funded at the same rate that, say UNC Chapel Hill or other schools are being funded. And so we have to make sure that we hold our lawmakers accountable, right, for fully funding education. I think there's also something that we think about when we think about the funding of education, and that's just the simple fact that we do not have a balance, right? So HBCUs do not have the endowments, right, and all the access to funding that like some of the other PWIs or predominantly white institutions have. So how can we make sure that we are holding the lawmakers accountable? How can we make sure we have good fiscal policies in place to grow our endowment? And those are two of the things that I think would really, really help. Make sure states fund it, because we're seeing that huge move away from states fully funding education, period. And so when they move away from funding it, period, you already know the HBCUs get the short end of the stick. And so we have to make sure that they fully fund education.
Got it. No, you're exactly right. I know UNCF is doing a lot of work there. They recently released their HBCU Economic Impact Report,
Mm-hmm.
and one of their calls to action, in addition to showing the tremendous values that HBCUs have upon their local, state, regional, and national economies, was a call to action, right, to make sure that they are fully funded, both state for land grant and also, at the federal level for all HBCUs. If we take a step back, before students even get to college, we have to be sure that they're ready, right? How do some of the disparities in K-12 education impact college readiness, particularly for students of color?
That's a really, really good question. When I think about like what happens for college readiness, number one, we have to understand that a lot of students who live in areas that are predominantly Black and brown and low income communities, they don't have access to, advanced AP courses, right? And so how do we make sure that they have access to these courses that will help them be successful in school? We also have limited access to STEM education. So we want to make sure that those schools that are in Black and brown neighborhoods have those advanced courses so that they can really be ready. We also want to talk about underfunding schools. Many schools are funded due to tax dollars. And in Black and brown areas, we talked about the racial wealth gap again. There's just this notion that, those areas are not, they may not have access to the same tax base that other areas have access to. So we want to make sure that we think about like, how are we chronically underfunding these schools, right? Like what type of textbooks do they have? Are their textbooks outdated? Do they have insufficient technology? Are their classrooms overcrowded? Do they have adequate extracurricular programs? All of these things make up a well-rounded student, which allow them to get into school. We also think about like counseling, right? And career counseling. Like, are they receiving adequate career counseling? Do students of color, they tend to go to schools where they don't have enough counselors because they have to make difficult decisions about like FTEs, full-time equivalents. And so I think another thing that we have to talk about, and I saw this in my school, like low expectations, right? There's a culture of low expectations that can exist sometimes at schools that are predominantly Black and brown, right? Where students feel like, like my parents didn't go to school, if I can just do this, I'll be okay. I can just get a job. And I want to acknowledge that college isn't for everyone, but the way our economy is moving, you have to have some form of post-secondary education. And so I think about those things. I think about the disciplinary policies, right? I think about school climate, the school to prison pipeline. When you go to schools in Black and brown neighborhoods, you may have bars on the windows. You go to other schools, they don't have those sort of things. And so what type of message are we inadvertently sending to students? And so those are some of the things that I think about. I think about the learning loss that takes place. How are we making sure that students, over the summer and over breaks have access to education so they don't lose that? And so those are the things that I think about that we could really fix to really address the K-12 disparities.
Got it. That's a very holistic approach, especially the counseling piece. I used to tutor students in New York when I lived there, and there were many times that there weren't enough counselors. The students said there weren't counselors, and even across my career working with students, some have never been exposed to HBCUs
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't have a counselor, or even the process of getting ready for college because there wasn't someone either at home and or at the school to help them prepare. So thank you for sharing that. We're here with Robert T. Stevens. He's the Chief of State and Regional Operations for Education Reform Now. Robert, as we wrap up, two things I'm curious to know. Obviously there's a big election coming up. I mean, we're talking, days away at this point. And I have honestly, as someone who keeps track with education, not heard a whole lot of discussions on either side about education. in this particular presidential election. I know there are other races obviously going on as well. Why should education be a priority? And why has it not been fully discussed, I think, in the public and in the debates and what have you?
Yeah. I mean, education has to be a priority because everyone wants their children to do better, right, than them.
Hmm.
They want to make sure their children are being set up for success. We have polling data that shows that after the economy, education is actually top three. It's one of the top three issues that families care about. It is a kitchen table issue. You have the economy, you have like Maslow hierarchy of needs, but very high is the education. And so it has not been a part of the discourse in the way that we would want it. And we're working really hard to inject it into that. And I think part of that is because a lot of times people think that their schools are doing better than what they're really doing. There's data that shows that schools they've definitely made some advancements, right? And we're in the trend line, we're growing, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And education is a real personal thing. It's also, like, contrary to popular beliefs, it can be really divisive, right? Because there's certain ways people think, there's NIMBY, not in my backyard. Some people, they like charter schools. Some people don't like charter schools. You have to jump in where you fit in. But the biggest thing, and I say this to everyone, we want good quality schools for individuals, good quality public schools for individuals. No matter where you live, you should be able to have access to a good school. You should be able to make sure that when you go to school, you're learning, right? You have real good teachers. The classroom culture is good. The school culture is good. And so we're going to continue to do that. We're seeing individuals talk about it more, but actually you're absolutely correct. That's our job, right? Like, our job is to inject education into the public discourse. And we're writing op-eds. We're having conversations with candidates at the top of the ticket, even towards the bottom of the ticket. So all up and down the ticket, we're talking about education, and we're working to get it back into the public discourse in the way it should.
Got it. Working to get it back into the public discourse the way it should. Thank you so much, Robert Stevens. Where can folks find out more about education reform now and the work that you do?
Yes, you can find us at our website, www.educationreformnow, and we would love to have you all there. You can also find me on social media, Robert Stevens _ and you can find me on our website, social media, all those things. We'll be happy to reach out to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this engaging discussion about how your personal journey as an HBCU student has led to the powerful and meaningful work that you're doing in education reform, both personally and professionally through Education Reform Now. Thank you so much for being here, Robert.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And for those who are watching, we're wrapping our discussion with Robert T. Stevens, Chief of State and Regional Operations for Education Reform Now. Be sure to share this episode with family, friends, and Winston-Salem State University alums. Share it with them as well. Check out all of our podcasts on Black Enterprise and everything happening on our social channels and the latest and greatest digital content on blackenterprise.com. For this episode of Class is in Session, I'm your host, Ashley Stevens, and class is dismissed.